Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Covenant, which is episode 9 of season 7 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as requested by my viewers. This episode was requested by Andrew Clark. So Covenant was the episode where Colonel Kira gets a visit from her childhood priest, Vedic Fala. He gives her a gift that ends up being a transponder that allows her to be beamed directly to Impact Nor by long-range Dominion transporters. There she finds the station is being held by a cult that worships the Pa race, and its leader is Gul Dukat. Dukat tries to convince Kira to join his cult, where Kira tries to convince the others that Dukat is a fraud. However, the others are so devoted that they don't listen to her. However, Kira learns of Mika, who is a pregnant woman and is about to give birth, who apparently had to gain special permission to have a child with her husband, Binyan. However, once the baby is born, it's revealed to be half Cardassian. Dukat makes up a story about this being a sign from the Pa race, but Kira doesn't buy it for an instant, and while all of his followers seem to buy Dukat's story, Binyan's face starts to crack. Then Dukat tries to kill Mika in an airlock to cover his tracks, but Kira interrupts him and saves her life, but doesn't prove that it was Dukat who tried to kill her, so he passed it off as an accident. So before Mika wakes and reveals that what Dukat did, he comes up with a plan to commit mass suicide with the entire group by swallowing poison pills. However, Kira breaks out of her room and knocks Dukat's pills out of his hand right when he's about to take it. Fala gives him another pill, but then when he refuses to take it, it's revealed that he is a fraud who never planned to die with them and was just going to kill them all to cover his tracks. So Dukat used his long-range transporter to beam away after everyone else was really pissed at him, and then Vedic Fala takes the pill anyway and kills himself. The rest of the cult members are rescued with Kira by the Defiant and return home. So I'll have to be completely upfront in that I've never been a fan of movies or TV episodes about cults. I don't know why, maybe it's because I have no frame of reference, but I really have never been that interested in cults or stories about cults. And stories about cults all seem to be very similar and simple. There's a charismatic leader who leads a bunch of people who follow blindly and are completely devoted to him when it's apparent to everyone else how big of a fraud he is. Now, I suppose it is an interesting twist that they make the cult leader, in this case, Dukat. It is kind of a natural progression for his character as he fits all of the characteristics, being a megalomaniac with a huge ego who wants to be adored by many, but above all is power hungry. However, on the other hand, it seems like the showrunners kind of just want to make Dukat as evil as possible and thus give him all these positions that never really suit him. So it may seem like a desperate attempt to make Dukat relevant again. And indeed, the showrunners did admit the concept of this episode came about because they wanted to find a way to bring Dukat back into the forefront, as they felt that he had faded into the background too much, with which I agree with. However, I don't think that this was necessarily the best way to do that. Now, Gul Dukat has always been one of my favorite characters, not just on Deep Space Nine, but all of Star Trek. In fact, in one of my videos, I name him as the second best villain in all of television. However, I'm not always happy with every single one of his appearances, and this whole making him obsessed with the Pa race thing that they did in Season 7 was one thing I was never really on board with. I didn't completely hate it, but I wasn't too crazy about it either. So this episode was written by someone who had a background in investigative journalism, who had written about cults several times before, so knew a lot about cults. So this cult scene in this episode was inspired by many real-life cults, and Gul Dukat for this episode was modeled after many infamous cult leaders. And although it does give the characters and a sense of realism, it also has a sense of familiarness of, being a tad bit too familiar. However, what's interesting about the portrayal of Dukat, which may set him apart from other real-life cult leaders, is that he actually believes in what he's saying, which is huge change in Dukat's character overall, which will hold until the end of the series, that he's a true believer in the Paul race. The writers even described this as a deliberate attempt to set up a conflict between Dukat and Sisko, and personally, I think they tried a tad bit too hard to make it a stereotypical fantasy-like good versus evil confrontation, which mirrors the prophets versus the Paul race, which I actually think makes the show lose some of its very typical dynamic structure, which has always been more complex than a simple good versus evil. However, Dukat remained in this episode to be a very complex character, as although he believed in the Paul race, he took that belief and twisted it to serve his own selfish purposes. And this is not only in keeping with Dukat's character, but also that of cult leaders who he is modeled after in this episode, as he actually believes himself a godlike person. And the scene where he suggests mass suicide was directly inspired by several cults. But in this episode, it did feel a bit sudden and out of place, because in these real-life cults, a suicide pact was somewhat interwoven into their belief system, whereas here it just seemed to come out of nowhere. But it was interesting that Dukat actually believed he was more righteous and presented, and represented good, whereas Sisko and the prophets represent evil in his mind. And that's a key to making any great villain, that they actually believe that they're the good guys. And of course, the revelation that Dukat raped one of his followers who had his baby, and then he tried to kill her to hide that fact, was also very true to Dukat's character and how a cult leader would behave. But again, it felt a kind of dull and a bit too typical in terms of storytelling. One of the more powerful messages of this episode is not just a warning of cults, but of religious extremism in general. The episode begins with Kira expressing how important her religion is to her, and Odo is even jealous of this source of strength and faith that she has. But then she meets Vedic Fala, a positive, always been a positive figure in her life, but he and all of Dukat's other followers believe in their faith so strongly that they blindly follow who is very apparent a madman, which I suppose is what happens with any cults, but is inherent to not just cults, but sects of religious extremism in general. Though it's a powerful message that although Kira's religion is a source of strength for her, it warns that if taken to an extreme where people follow blindly without applying logic or caution, it could become a very dangerous thing. One complaint I had, which may apply more to the end of the series than to this episode, is that episodes like this really establish the conflict between Kira and Dukat, which has been emphasized a lot throughout the series, but it was never resolved. In fact, this is the last time in the show that Kira and Dukat appear on screen together, as they decided to turn the focus to Dukat versus Sisko, because Sisko is the star of the show. But honestly, I always found the Kira-Dukat conflict to be more interesting. So if this episode is guilty of anything, it's of doing its job too well in establishing the Kira and Dukat adversary, not the Sisko and Dukat adversary relationship. So it was a shame that this was never really followed up on. So having this cult inhabit impact Nor was the very obvious excuse so that the showrunners could use the same sets as Deep Space Nine without having to spring for more money for new sets. And I suppose it wasn't too out of place to have them on the space station, but it would have made a lot more sense to me to have them on a planet. But all in all, I don't really think it takes anything away from the episode. It just seems so obvious that they just did it so they could save some cash, but whatever. So my rating out of 10 for Covenant is a 4 poor. It was an okay episode. It was great seeing conflict between Dukat and Kira play out, but of course, this is a conflict that was never resolved, and all in all, this was just a typical cult story with all the typical cult cliches that didn't really offer anything new, and I suppose overall it was in keeping with Dukat's character, but it's not really what I want to see out of him, of him turning into a David Koresh. That's not really what I had in mind for a great Dukat story. So that's it for my review of Covenant. If there's a Star Trek episode from any of the 5 Star Trek series you'd like me to review, just leave a comment below with the episode you'd like me to review, but please only 1 episode request per person. Also be advised that it will be several months before I'm able to get to any of your requests. Also, be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Mr. Robot, Dark Matter, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.